The Ottoman Constitution of 1876 was the first constitution of the Ottoman Empire, written by members of the Young Ottomans, particularly Midhat Pasha, during the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The constitution was only in effect for 2 years, from 1876 to 1878, in a period known as the First Constitutional Era. Later it was put back into effect and amended to transfer more power from the Sultan and the appointed Senate to the generally elected Chamber of Deputies after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, initiating a period known as the Second Constitutional Era. In the course of the studies in Europe, some members of the new Ottoman elite concluded that the secret of Europe's success rested not just with its technical achievements but also with its political organizations. Moreover, the process of reform itself had imbued a small segment of this elite with the belief that constitutional government would be a desirable check on autocracy and provide them with a better opportunity to influence policy. Sultan Abdul Aziz's chaotic rule led to his deposition in 1876 and, after a few troubled months, to the proclamation of an Ottoman constitution that the new Sultan Abdul Hamid II pledged to uphold. Background: the Ottoman constitution was introduced after a series of reforms were promulgated in 1839 during the Tanzimat era. The goal of the Tanzimat era was to reform the Ottoman Empire under the auspices of Westernization. In the context of the reforms, Western-educated Armenians of the Ottoman Empire drafted the Armenian National Constitution in 1863. The Ottoman Constitution of 1876 was under direct influence of the Armenian National Constitution and its authors. The Ottoman Constitution of 1876 itself was drawn up by Western-educated Ottoman Armenian Krikor Odion, who was the advisor of Midhat Pasha. It is important to discuss first the beginning of attempts at reform within the empire. Under the reign of Sultan Selim III, there was a vision of actual reform. Selim tried to address the military's failure to effectively function in battle. Even the basics of fighting were lacking, and military leaders lacked ability to command. Eventually his efforts led to his assassination by the Janissaries. This action led to Mahmud II becoming Sultan. Mahmud can be considered to be the first real Ottoman reformer, since he took a substantive stand against the Janissaries by removing them as an obstacle. This led to what was known as the Tanzimat era, which lasted from 1839 to 1876. This era was defined as an effort of reform to distribute power from the Sultan to the newly formed government led by a parliament. These were the intentions of the Sublime Porters, which included the newly formed government. The purpose of the Tanzimat era was reform, but mainly to divert power from the Sultan to the Sublime Porte. The first indefinable act of the Tanzimat period was when Sultan Abdul Hamid I issued Edict of Gulain. This document, a statement, expressed the principles that the liberal statesman wanted to become an actual reality. The Tanzimat politicians wanted to prevent the empire from falling completely into ruin. During this time the Tanzimat had 3 different sultans: Abdul Hamid, Abdulaziz I and Murad V. During the Tanzimat period, the man from the Ottoman Empire with the most respect in Europe was Midhat Pasha. Midhat dreamed of an empire in which there would be neither Muslim nor non-Muslim but only Ottomans. Quote, such ideology led to the formation of groups such as the Young Ottomans and the Committee of Union and Amp Progress. These movements attempted to bring about real reform not by means of edicts and promises but by concrete action. European influence. After its pinnacle during the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was thereafter in constant regression rather than being able to progress as its European counterparts did. As European power increased, the Ottomans saw a lack of progress themselves. In the Treaty of Paris, the Ottomans were now considered part of the European world. This was the beginning of the first steps of intervention that the Europeans began in the Ottoman Empire. One of the reasons they were taking a step into Ottoman territory was for the protection of Christians in the empire. There had been a long-lasting political war between Muslims and non-Muslims within it. This was the focal point for the Russians to interfere, and the Russians were perhaps the Ottomans' most disliked enemy. The Russians looked for many ways to become involved in political affairs, especially when unrest in the empire reached the borders. The Russians and Ottomans went to war on numerous occasions for different reasons. The Ottomans saw the Russians as the most fierce enemy and not one to be trusted. Framework. After Sultan Murad was removed from office, Abdul Hamid II became the new sultan. Midhat Pasha was afraid that Abdul Hamid would go against his progressive visions. Consequently, he had an interview with him to assess his personality and to determine if he was on board. The constitution proposed a bicameral parliament, the General Assembly, consisting of the Sultan's selected Senate and the generally elected Chamber of Deputies. There were also elections held every 4 years to keep the parliament changing and to continually express the voice of the people. This same framework carried over from the constitution as it was in 1876 until it was reinstated in 1908. All in all, the framework on the constitution did little to limit the Sultan's power. Some of the retained powers of the Sultan were declaration of war, appointment of new ministers, and approval of legislation. Domestic and foreign reactions. Reactions within the empire and around Europe were both widely acceptable and potentially a cause for some concern. Before the constitution was enacted and made official, many of the ulama were against it because they deemed it to be going against the Sharia. However, throughout the Ottoman Empire, the people were extremely happy and looking forward to life under this new regime. Many people celebrated and joined in Muslim-Christian relations which formed, and there now seemed to be a new national identity, Ottoman. However, many provinces and people within the empire were against it, and many acted out their displeasure in violence. Some Muslims agreed with the ulama that the constitution violated Sharia law. Some acted out the protests by attacking a priest during Mass. Some of provinces referred to in the constitution were alarmed, such as Romania, Scutari and Albania, because they thought it referred to them having a different change of government and no longer being autonomous from the empire. Yet the most important reaction, only second to that of the people, was that of the Europeans. The reactions were quite to the contrary from the people. In fact, they were completely against it, so much so that England was against supporting the Sublime Porte and criticized their actions as reckless. Many across Europe saw this constitution as unfit or a last attempt to save the empire. In fact, only 2 small nations were in favor of the constitution, but only because they disliked the Russians as well. Others considered the Ottomans to be grasping for straws in trying to save the empire. They also labeled it as a fluke of the Sublime Porte and the Sultan. Second Constitutional Era. The constitution was put back into effect in 1908 as Abdul Hamid II came under pressure, particularly from some of his military leaders. Abdul Hamid II's fall came as a result of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, and the Young Turks put the 1876 constitution back into effect. The second constitutional period spanned from 1908 until after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was dissolved. Many political groups and parties were formed during this period, including the Committee of Union and Progress. Significance of the Constitution. The Ottoman Constitution represented more than the immediate effect it had on the country. Despite the latitude it gave to the sovereign, the Constitution provided clear evidence of the extent to which European influences operated among a section of the Ottoman bureaucracy. The Constitution also reaffirmed the equality of all Ottoman subjects, including the right to serve in the new Chamber of Deputies. The Constitution was more than a political document, it was a proclamation of Ottomanism and Ottoman patriotism, and it was an assertion that the empire was capable of resolving its problems and that it had the right to remain intact as it then existed.